the podium, Will Davis.
Well, thank you, Ms. Collins, for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. Today it's my honor and privilege to introduce to you the speaker, the man of the hour, for making sense of the 2020 election. Basil Smikle Jr. is a distinguished lecturer of politics and public policy at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and a political strategist with a PhD in politics and education from Columbia University. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science from Cornell University in Industrial and Labor Relations and received a Master's of Public Administration degree from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He is a familiar face on media outlets like MSNBC and CNN, where he frequently appearances highlights his insights on electoral politics and public policy. Basil was most recently the executive director of the New York Democratic Party, during which time he was the second highest ranking Democrat in the state he currently lectures at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and Teachers College. As an executive director of the Democratic Party, he worked closely with the Buffalo Mayor Brown, and Governor Cuomo to manage strategic and fundraising activities for the state, which includes fundraising and oversight of a multi-million-dollar operating budget. He recruited candidates for political office and worked closely with the Democratic National Committee to create partnerships, engage donors, and act as a surrogate for local and national outlets. Recognized as a staunch advocate for public service and education equality, he is part of the next generation of thinkers and policy advocates. Basil was featured in the LA Times as Harlem's new political elite. City Hall magazine once named him one of the 50 rising stars in New York politics. U.S. Senator and presidential candidate Cory Booker called him a much sought after consultant. The Reverend Al Sharpton called him an impressive speaker. Former Governor David Paterson noted that Basil is a national caliber political operative. He gained national attention for his reforms in education and government. An early profile in the Wall Street Journal led to a feature in a New York Magazine cover story of next generation of African American leaders. The New York Daily News called Basil a fresh thinking school reformer. The New York Post enthusiastically said, New York needs such vibrant leadership. Basil was a senior aide to Hillary Rodham Clinton's campaign during her first Senate run, and later on her Senate staff. Miss Clinton called Basil a key advisor and tremendous public servant who makes sure all voices are heard. Ron Kirk, the mayor of Dallas and President Obama's former U.S. trade representative, noted that Basil can negotiate the politics in any community and knows how to marry it with sound public policy. He's a lifelong New Yorker and raised in the Bronx by Jamaican immigrants. He is inspired by his father, a retired textile worker, and mother, a longtime public school special education teacher. Basil is a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and if you do watch him on the weekends, he's always wearing an Alpha pin. And I met Brother Basil at MSNBC actually last summer, and I knew immediately I needed to invite him to speak at Hofstra. So without further ado, please welcome Brother Dr. Basil Smikle to the stage.
Good morning. Is it still morning? Yes, it is. Good morning. Brother Davis, man, thank you so very much for those kind words. And I do remember when we met at MSNBC, and I think the first thing I said to you was, if I can be any help to you, if you need me to come out, just let me know. And a few weeks later, or a few months later, here I am. So first and foremost, thank you for the work that you do at MSNBC. It's good to see faces like us there, working behind the scenes. And secondly, apparently you are more embedded in the history of Hofstra University than I have ever met anyone. Your father went here, your grandmother's worked here, and I got to meet her before we came over. I met your dad, and I will tell you, there are generations of your family that are involved in this university, and that's what we call legacy. And so, God bless you in the work that you do. To my brothers, Xi Chapter Alpha Phi Alpha, and the AKA who I see is here, for the AKAs, the Deltas, and the Zetas, and all my sisters and brothers who are here. Thank you for coming to the Center for Civic Engagement and the Cultural Center of Hofstra University. Thank you so much for hosting me today. I do have some remarks, but we're at a college campus and I'm among students and friends, so I want to hear a lot from you as well. So I want to make sure that we do have some time to take questions, because I really do want to hear from you, and to the extent that I can, I want to be able to respond to some of the burning questions you have about what's going on today. I also want to say thank you to Ms. Collins for hosting, and to Linda Longmire for our conversation earlier on the radio. That airs at what time? All right, so you can hear our half-hour conversation at that time. But where we started there is where I actually like to start here. You heard my bio, and sometimes when I hear my bio being read, I think I need a vacation, and I probably do. But I want to talk a little bit about what's not in the bio, and just talk a little bit about how I became politically active and aware, which really does inform how I view the world and how I engage in politics, and sort of the themes that I'll talk about today. But I was raised in the Bronx by Jamaican parents that came here in 1970. My grandmother also came with them because, they were out trying to find work and trying to find jobs. My grandmother was the one that took care of me for the most part, while my father worked in the textile industry and he worked a lot of long hours and weekends. My mother did teach daycare for a while and then went back to school, went to Lehman College, got a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degrees. So my earliest memories of my mom are waking up in the morning and listening to her type on the typewriter, going to bed at night typing as well. And I don't mean computer, I mean like real typewriter, banging keys. And she hated that I told the story, but she couldn't type. So my grandmother was reading to her while she was there typing away. But those are the memories that I have of my parents being here and trying to sort of make their way here in America. And I actually detail the story that we were very modest. I shared a bed with my grandmother, I think, until I was 10, different beds, same room until I went to college. So, she and I were like brother and sister. She passed away in 1998. She was 9 years old, but I don't think I've ever been closer to anybody in my life. Sort of the lessons that she taught me about, she didn't actually teach me a lot about politics, but she just taught me about human relationships. She taught me about the world. She taught me about being a good observer, that not to speak as much, but listen to what people say, because you can learn so much when you just listen to people and observe the world. So I was largely informed by that. When I got to Cornell, because I had done all this work in high school in terms of my public service and so on, I really wanted to get involved with that at Cornell. What I found really interesting about Cornell was that there were a lot of us that were recruited. This is back in 1989. A long time ago. Back in 1989, a lot of my friends, we were recruited to go to Cornell, but we were smart but broke, smart but under resourced, right? And we didn't know how much we didn't know when we got there. And that was a real wake-up call to us, particularly for folks that wanted to be in public service. How do we use the platform that we have to get involved in going back to the communities that we cared about and grew up in, to be politically active? This was incredibly important to me, because when I was in Catholic school, I went to Catholic school for 12 years, so I wore a jacket and tie my whole life. This beard I'm rebelling now because I couldn't have facial hair then. But at that time, I was
I was 12 years old, and a 14-year-old, this is kind of the beginnings of the crack epidemic, 14-year-old kept trying to get me to sell drugs for him, and I refused, so he shot me. So gun control obviously is a pretty big deal to me, right? But he's 14 and I'm 12. Needless to say, I put my head in the books after that. Didn't really go outside much after that. But the point that I'm making is that there are a lot of my friends who didn't make it or who are in and out of prison. And for those of us that, and not just in my neighborhood, but in the neighborhoods of friends of mine across the city, we wound up sort of really digging into books and using that energy to go to a place like Cornell and getting there and almost getting into a place where our sort of ambitions were stomped because we were having such a difficult time there. I use that as an example because while we were there, I was on food stamps for 4 years. So I'm on this big time Ivy League campus with some of the wealthiest people in the world. And here I am on food stamps. I didn't meet a rich Black person until I got to Cornell. I was like, I thought those were only on TV. They were unicorns, but they were folks who were up there who were wealthy. And most of my friends, as I said, we were up there paying for our food with food stamps. It's the only way we can eat. That story is important to me. It's true, by the way, but that story is important to me, and I carry it with me everywhere I go and every place that I see. What may have been the difference between my family and my upbringing versus someone else's who may have gone into prison or who had been killed. I try to be able to figure out what the difference was. To be honest with you, I don't know. I can't really say it was one person's family over another. It wasn't one person's school over another. They say there, but go there, but for the grace of God, go I. And I truly believe that. And acknowledge that I may not know the reason, but I do have to have a responsibility, I felt, to be back in my community, to talk to people about process, to talk to people about politics, to connect politics and public policy. Even as recent as yesterday, when a student of mine at CUNY, who is probably in her 30s and 40s, we had a special election in New York City yesterday, she said outright, I don't vote. And she was very adamant. She's like, I don't vote, I don't think it matters, I don't care. And I had a whole lecture prepared that day. I actually took the first half hour of my class to explain why it's important for her to vote. And she went and voted. Because I ended class early to make sure she could get home to do it. So she went and voted. She emailed me this morning and thanked me for actually taking the time to explain it to her, because no one ever really had. No one ever really had. We say, you got to go out and vote, but why? But why? One of the things that I'll tell you, and I'll come back to this at some point, is that being a leader of a state party, I know if you don't. I know if you don't vote. I don't know for whom you voted, but I know if you don't vote. And I'll explain that a little later, and if you have a question about it, I'll tell you. But the truth of the matter is, I know that, and every single campaign knows that. They know who votes and who doesn't. We have an idea of for whom you voted. Don't know exactly, but we have an idea of who you voted for. And we have a sense of your likelihood to volunteer, your likelihood to donate. We have a sense of whether or not you're an influencer in your community. We know some really interesting stuff about you, by the way. But that's why it's so important to vote, because if you don't, we know that. And if you're a campaign that has limited resources and limited time, why are they going to come talk to you if they know that you don't vote? That's a cynical way of looking at it, but it's also true. I don't counsel anybody to do that. I don't counsel anybody to say, don't talk to these populations, don't go into this neighborhood, don't talk to that house. Because if that were the case, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would not be elected today. She was a giant killer, right? She would not be elected today if she had that mindset. So this is the power of voting. This is the power of creating opportunities and giving people who did not previously have a voice in the process. So I want to take a minute to talk about a conversation that I had, which goes into this issue of voice and people who felt excluded, and use that as a way to sort of talk about how we got to where we are today and where we're going, where I think we may be going in 2020. So I was speaking at Cornell about a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago, and I had 4 hours to kill. I got up there early, I'd already eaten, had about 4 hours to kill. So what do you do when you have 4 hours to kill? And I think in New York, you get a tattoo. So I got this tattoo. And you know, it's a captive audience, right? Because I'm there, my arms stretched out, and I have somebody just, you know, drawing away on my skin. So I don't typically talk about what I do for a living because, you know, if you don't recognize me from TV or whatever, I'm not the kind of person to go say, yeah, I do this and I work for this person, because it kind of brings about a lot of passionate responses from people. Some are welcome, some not so welcome. But I've learned also, going back to what my grandmother used to say, to not always speak, but I listen and I observe. So in this sort of moment where, you know, I'm trying not to cry, and no, I didn't cry when I got my tattoo. I can take it. But at this time, you know, there's this guy who was drawn on my arm, and you know, he asked me what brought me to back to Cornell. I told him I was giving a speech, and we started to talk a little bit about politics. So I asked him, what's his affiliation? And he said, well, he thinks he's a libertarian, but he's not a member of either party. So I said, that's interesting. Libertarians are interesting folks. Anybody libertarian in here? All right, if you are and don't want to say, that's okay too. But libertarians are interesting people because there are some that are, you know, I don't want government involved in anything, but they really care about being able to keep their guns. And then there are others that say we shouldn't even have public schools. So there's a sort of real range of folks who consider themselves libertarian. So he's a self-described libertarian. And I asked him a question that I ask a lot of people. Where do you get your news from? Where do you get your news from? And anybody guess what his answer was? Not Fox. That was my first guess, but no. YouTube. YouTube. He gets his news from YouTube. Now, why is that instructive? Because it says that there are folks in this country who have stepped out of the process so much, who feel so disconnected from certain aspects of society, that they are going straight to individuals who you can't necessarily verify the veracity of any of the statements that they're making, but those people speak so closely to them, their feelings. And a student somewhere, I was at Buffalo State about a week or so ago, and I told the same story, and the student said, there are a lot of folks out there that feel that they're missing something and they're angry. And I said, you know, that's really interesting that you say it, that you put it that way, that they feel that they're missing something. There's something missing in their lives. And and I go back to this tattoo artist who was talking about getting his news from YouTube because he felt that the person and the persons that he followed on YouTube spoke directly to him. It wasn't necessarily factual, but it touched something emotional in him that he responded to. And it goes to one of the points that I would make about why most people vote in this country. Now don't think about yourselves, because you're at an institution of higher learning. You go to class to study about voting and processes and discrimination. So you are not the average voter. You're not. But if you talk to average voters, why do you think, what drives them to the polls the most? What do you think? Show of hands. Anybody? Yes. They're unhappy. So what about emotional? What's an emotion that might drive them? It could be a lot of personal issues. That's absolutely right. People go because they are unhappy. They vote because of something that they feel is impacting them personally. And my mentor sort of distilled it to this point. He said, I have a lot of political rules of thumb, so this is one of them. People vote for one of two reasons, pride or anger. And one of the biggest motivators to get people to the polls is fear. So what does this gentleman do when he goes to YouTube? He's looking at videos that essentially are instilling a fear and an anger in him that is motivating a lot of how he looks at the world. Is that wrong? Well, it's not what I would do. It's not how I was raised. But I don't know if I could say that that's wrong, because there are people for whom this is the only way they feel they can engage those emotions and that anger and that frustration, or get any information about that personal issue that they're battling or that they're concerned about. I can't say that it's wrong. I could just say that it's not what I would do, and it's not what a lot of people around me would do. But we've come to realize that there are huge swaths of this country, huge swaths of voters in this country, for whom that is the norm. Show of hands. How many of you watch the nightly news? Lester Holt, CBS News. Yeah. Demographically, that's exactly what I thought. Demographically, it's exactly what I thought. How many of you watch cable news regularly? MSNBC, CNN, and Fox. And that's where you get most of your news. How many of you get a lot of your news from Twitter? Interesting. That's okay. Hey man, there's no discrimination here. It's fine. What about Instagram and Facebook that you get information and news about? Okay, from that. Interesting. So where else do you get your news from? Radio. Demographically, that's exactly where we should be, right? Where I thought you would be. Radio as well, right? Oh, an actual newspaper. How many people read either by hand, the hard copy, or online, at least one daily paper a day? 2? 3? Okay. So it's still somewhat traditional in this room, which is interesting, right? But I talked to some of my other students, they don't watch cable TV at all. They've cut the cord. How many have cut the cord? Exactly. There's so many of the folks that I engage, a lot of my students, they've cut the cord, so they actually don't watch cable news at all. They get a lot of their news from Twitter, and they're reading a lot more than I thought they actually would in terms of actual newspapers. They definitely don't get their news from YouTube and understand sort of what that is. But no one watches sort of the evening news anymore. Which is actually what I watch. And I watch PBS and Channel 13 and NPR. I listen to that as well. But a lot of younger folks don't actually do that as much anymore. And so this guy that I talked to in Ithaca, I think he was in his 30s. And so I started to sort of go a little deeper in terms of why he felt YouTube was the best place for him to understand how the world works and what he was learning from that. And it's interesting because it really did mirror a lot of what we were experiencing leading up to 2016. Consider gerrymandering, one of the most divisive tools in politics today. What gerrymandering has done is largely remove Democrats from the Midwest in this country. It's also created the polarization that we've seen first in Congress and now partly in the rest of the country, and then there are other things that added to that. But what gerrymandering has done is really created this stark difference between what it is to be a Democrat or Republican. There isn't much middle ground anymore, and you don't see a lot of compromise in our legislative body, in our legislative bodies broadly, but certainly in Congress. We don't see a lot of that middle ground anymore. I think this president has also taken a lot of the middle ground out of our discourse. So you sort of have to take a side. You're forced to take a side. And sometimes life just doesn't work that way. But largely because of gerrymandering as a tool that was used, gerrymandering has largely taken that kind of discourse out of our legislative process, which has certainly impacted our political discourse. What else has done that? Certainly the Supreme Court's rulings, like Citizens United and corporations are people. It's odd that corporations are people because they don't pay taxes like people, do they? That wasn't meant to be an Amazon dig. I'm sorry. That's another story for another day. But when the Supreme Court says that corporations are people, or when the Supreme Court essentially has gutted the main tools used to make our congressional races fair and more diverse, namely the Voting Rights Act, they gutted the Voting Rights Act, and they are continuing to roll back protections for minority voters and candidates. We saw that up until the midterms, 28 states had restrictions on who could vote and how you could vote. And so when you see that across the country, you have seen and will continue to see this division and this polarization and this disenfranchisement. Consider what happened with Stacey Abrams in Georgia. And her struggle to actually get a fair election and how close she came to winning. Andrew Gillum, the same thing. In North Carolina, they just decided to hold another election because of the allegations of voter fraud, or election fraud. And so when you combine things like Citizens United with gerrymandering and with these very restrictive voting laws, you are creating a situation where huge parts of the electorate do not get a voice and get disenfranchised. Now, in many ways, that's communities of color. But when you add in that's the scourge of birtherism, that tactic by then candidate, well, before candidate, but then just person Donald Trump, and a number of conservatives who attacked Barack Obama for not being American, for stoking that kind of fear, for saying that he actually probably didn't even go to Harvard, didn't finish Harvard, didn't do well at school. Mind you, this president, let me take a step back. The juxtaposition of what's happening in today's politics actually literally today is amazing, because the president's trying to make a deal with North Korea, which he believes can get him a Nobel Peace Prize. But his fixer in Michael Cohen is testifying in front of Congress that he's a liar and a sexist and racist and corrupt, right? This is where we are in politics today. And that very fixer is being accused and will testify to the fact today that he bullied schools to not give out his transcripts, the president's transcripts. But the same president accused Barack Obama of hiding his background and his academic records and so on and so forth. So you see that over the course of years, and this wasn't something that just happened overnight, over the course of a decade at least, you had this country being pulled apart, sometimes very subtly and sometimes very overtly. But that birtherism thing added a racial component that we are still living through. It added a demonizing component to the discourse that we are still dealing with and had to deal with and talked about a lot in 2016. So what happens in 2016? Remember that fear and anger thing? Remember that? Think about how he was so quick to dispatch. How many people ran in the Republican primary in 2016? Like 20 people. It's like a whole school bus full of people. And he had the happy hour debate and the main debate, right? And so look at how quickly he was able to just one by one, little Marco, boring Jeb. Was it boring Jeb? Whatever we said about it. Huh? Low energy Jeb. Little Marco, just quickly just dispatching people little by little, over and over again, until it came down to him and maybe one or two other people, right? And how did he do that? He did that by mocking a New York Times reporter who had a disability. He antagonized the media. He talked about Hillary and the lock her up chants, right? The build the wall chants, which we're still hearing. And the way he talked about communities of color, the way he talked about immigrants, the way he talked about African Americans. I was a young man in 1988, 89, 17, 18 years old. I remember the Central Park Five. I remember that whole incident. I remember him taking a full page ad out in the newspapers calling for these men to get the death penalty. I remember that. I remember believing that he was racist then, let alone everything that he said subsequent to that, right? So I never watched The Apprentice. I ain't watched that at all, right? Because this is what's in my mind, his treatment of people in my community. So we go through 2016, and I will say, he did not create the climate, but he capitalized on the climate that had already been created. He capitalized on the groundwork that had already been laid for his type of candidacy. And I will tell you that the ability to break through that was difficult beyond measure. I was on TV almost every day in 2016 talking about this race as a surrogate for the party and eventually for Hillary. How about those emails though, right? Like in comparison, like really? But in trying to break through the conversation to talk about his background, and mind you, whatever this Mueller investigation uncovers, I don't know if it'll ever meet the threshold of impeachment, but it certainly has reverse engineered all of the due diligence that we should have done back in 2016 when he was running to figure out his conflicts of interest and so on and so forth. So you're hearing a lot of that now, but we tried to talk about that then. Nobody wanted to hear it because they wanted to focus on those emails. That's not just racism, that's also sexism. That's also misogyny. I can't tell you the number of times I remember very clearly, I was on the network about a year before she announced, I was debating someone who I have a great relationship with, a Republican who I have a great relationship with. We were on a panel. She had a granddaughter, and the guy was debating was like, he didn't think Hillary would win. She wants to go raise her grandkid and take care of her family. I was like, wow, you didn't say that about John McCain. Why is that? Why is that? Right? But to be sort of front and center for the racism, the sexism, the misogyny that was being lobbed, not just as Democrats, and I work for the party and certainly have been a boss for the party, but if I take my hat off and just be sort of a black man from the Bronx, I saw it day in and day out and experienced it day in and day out. We had very little ability to cut through that because that fear and that anger is so strong, so prevalent. And if you look today at what he's doing, where we are in this country today, you find that even though he's being called out for his misstatements, his lies, racism, sexism, misogyny, so on and so forth, you want to hear something that voters say about him? It's changing a little bit, but for the longest time, you know what voters said about him? When asked about his misstatements and his claims, they say, you can't take him literally. Take him figuratively. You have to, you should never take him literally. He's just kind of saying that for the sake of saying it. I said, when have we said that about our president ever in this country? He certainly didn't hold Obama to the same standard, right? There was a controversy when he wore the tan suit. The whole tan suit thing was like, y'all remember that? Remember that? Like, we spent a week talking about him wearing a tan suit and whether or not that was appropriate for the White House, right? But you have legions of voters saying, don't take him literally, take him figuratively. This is challenging for us because how do we go and tell people how important your vote is when you can't take the people you vote into office literally? Can't take what they say literally. So how am I supposed to communicate the importance of the vote? So how then do we take him figuratively if he does what no president has done before, which is communicate directly to his supporters through Twitter? Now, it's easily dismissed as someone just using Twitter. But you have to be mindful of the fact that presidents don't do that, historically have not done that. A president would rarely do their own White House press conference. Oftentimes you'd hear from them through their press secretary, through surrogates and others. But the president, for the first time, is really having a direct conversation with his supporters, and in my estimation, has not finished campaigning. He hasn't really transitioned into governing. He's sort of still campaigning, and as a result of that, all of his statements are meant to drive people to action. They're meant to drive his supporters to mobilize, and they're mobilizing around what? They're mobilizing around a wall. They're mobilizing around anger and hatred and fear, in my opinion. And I do talk about this often and openly. So now we have to go back and teach people, don't take the president at his word. Just, it's symbolic of everything else that, it's symbols. It's not meant to be taken literally. And that's sort of where we are in this country. So now, if you're a 2020 candidate running for president of the United States, how do you tackle that? How do you go against that? Now, we have a lot of Democrats running, if you haven't heard. And I like them all. One of the things that I think we ultimately are going to wrestle with as a party and as a country, do we have to make a choice between electability or progressive politics? And that's an important choice if we have to make it. Maybe in some way, shape, or form, all of that is contained in one candidate. I don't know that I see that yet. But ultimately, that may be what this election comes down to from a Democratic Party standpoint. Do we have to make a choice between electability and progressive politics? I like Kamala a lot. I know Cory Booker and like him a lot. There are a lot of folks out there that are waiting for Joe Biden. Can I tell you how weirdly unfair this conversation is, going back to sexism and misogyny? We are waiting with bated breath for Joe Biden. We have quickly welcomed Bernie Sanders to the fold. Both of them older than Hillary Clinton, by the way, who we are regularly telling to get off the stage. Yeah, I just want to point that out. I'm just saying. Speaking of Bernie, his candidacy is going to be interesting this time around for a number of reasons. Partly because a lot of stuff that he talked about in 2016, every other candidate is talking about now, right? You notice that. And so the question then becomes, what's the sort of lane that he then occupies if everybody else is sort of talking about things that we talk about? And let's go back to my friend in Ithaca, the tattoo artist. Don't get caught up in this conversation about democratic socialism. Why? Because, number one, it's just not true. This is messaging and narrative that the conservatives have done and actually do very well. I'm not going to lie, they actually do that very well. And try to frame the narrative before we have an opportunity to frame it for ourselves. Which is why we're not talking about universal health care, we're talking about Medicare for all, right? That just sounds better, right? Or different, right? Depending on your perspective. And so this framing of democratic socialism is interesting to me because if you actually look at where Bernie won in the primary in 2016, Donald Trump also won. Why is that? That should scare some people, but actually when you think about it, it actually makes complete sense. Anybody guess why? I'm in school, I'm going to be a professor. Anybody guess why? Yes?
They were both proposing very radical changes, and I think that people wanted a radical change, even if it was from Hillary.
Radical change. What else did Trump say that Bernie said? What else did Bernie and Trump share? Besides radical change, which is absolutely true.
The system is rigged.
System is rigged. The system is rigged. The parties don't serve you. Government is full of elites that don't serve your interests. For a very brief moment in time, Bernie's narrative and Trump's narrative or messaging, not narrative, but messaging, were very similar for a brief moment in time before Trump went Trump. But for a moment in time, their messaging was very similar. System is rigged. Your lives are no better than they were 4 years ago or 10 years ago because you have elites in both parties screwing you over. We talk about universal health care, Medicare for all. Where did the Affordable Care Act do the most good? In red states, among red state voters, right? People didn't like Obamacare, but they loved the hell out of the Affordable Care Act, right? And so, but this goes back to the point I was making before in terms of how people get their news, how they receive information, and what they've been told or counseled to sort of lobby against or mobilize against, even if it's against their own interest. And that is one of the things that in this business is so difficult to deal with. How do you tell voters that they're voting against their own interests? Get them to stop doing that. But what this president has done, and it's been done before, he wasn't the first, he won't be the last, but what this president has done very, very well is convince a huge number of Americans to vote against their own interests. So now that Bernie Sanders is in this race and you have the Democratic candidates talking a lot now about what he talked about in 2016, I do wonder where his lane's going to be, but I would tell you $10 plus million in a couple of days is pretty good. And he has the ability to go on in this race for an extended period of time and perhaps outlast his other opponents. And it would be interesting to see if by the end of this cycle, he and maybe one or two others are viewed as electable and progressive enough. Bill Clinton used to say, you have to, if you're running against an incumbent or a prevailing idea, you have to convince voters to fire him and hire you. We've done a pretty good job of telling voters why they should fire Donald Trump. But will we do a good job at telling voters why we should be hired? It really will come down to that. Are we going to be talking about progressive policies enough that are not just Democrat and Republican, but huge voting blocks in this country actually do care about? Healthcare, affordable college, who doesn't care about that, right? Healthcare, affordable college, things that are impacting people like me, an older generation, my parents, certainly all of you. I'm sorry if we haven't done a good enough job for the students in the room. If we haven't done a good enough job of, sort of saving the world and making it a better place for you, I'm sorry about that. We are trying. So my biggest piece of advice to you from people like me is if anyone like me in positions like mine tell you no, go around us. Don't take our no for an answer. And I really do mean that. Because it was done to me. It was done to many of my friends. It was done to many of my colleagues. And good people with good ideas and good energy and good values end up not engaging in this process, and then also telling people not to engage in the process because of the experiences they've had when they tried to step up to the plate and then get those aspirations smashed. So one of the big pieces of advice I can give you is don't take a no. Go around me if need be. And I'm happy for you to do that. Do it nicely, but wave to me as you go around me, but go around me. But I say that to say that what we're trying to figure out now is how to harness your energy, the energy of folks who Bernie brought to the process, for example, because there were so many that he brought to the process. There's so many who couldn't vote for him, that wanted to vote for him, that now have been motivated to go run for office on their own. In fact, in the public advocate special election we had in New York City yesterday, and we had a lot of candidates these days. There were 17 candidates, and I think 4 of them were Bernie supporters. And in fact, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was also a Bernie supporter. So even though he didn't win in 2016, his impact is still being felt to this day. But we still have to harness that energy. That's still very important to us, to the future of the party. And why is that important? Because more and more people don't care about political parties anymore. They just don't. Barack Obama won by going around the party. Bernie Sanders in many cases ran against the party. And when you talk to more and more voters out there, they don't necessarily identify with where the parties stand today. It's not reflective of their politics. And the truth is, when you can hear directly from your president through his Twitter account, what do you need the party for? If you're a political scientist, what is the parties for? The parties were that go-between that went from the governor, the governing bodies, the political leaders. They were the middlemen, the sort of intermediaries between those folks and the voters and the constituents, the grassroots. But if those leaders can have conversations with the grassroots, what does the party become useful for? That's an open question, right? On the presidential level, we can see that a little more. We can see that dynamic taking place already. At the local level, why are political parties still important? Because it's still a way that it helps organize ideas and it gets people down ballot elected. I cannot tell you how important it is to elect people up and down the ballot. Presidential campaigns are very sexy, but so is county executive and dog catcher and town council. Why? Because state politics is the politics that has the most impact on your day-to-day lives. Day-to-day lives. From healthcare to in some ways, gun control and criminal justice reform, which is obviously a big issue and has been for a few years and will become a bigger issue on this campaign, particularly as Kamala Harris begins the campaign around the country. Everything, the death penalty, state laws, but we can't get people to come out and vote in state elections. Those are one of the biggest challenges for us. Presidential campaigns are very sexy indeed because what presidential candidates do is create a social political movement around their candidacy. It's really hard to do that when you're running for state assembly or city council. It's just difficult. But those positions are just as important, and in some cases more important, because they really do affect your day-to-day lives. And so what's really important is not just to get young people activated to vote in presidential elections and to revitalize the political parties, but also to get more involved in state elections and to push people to get more involved in their state elections. There's a massive fall off in the off years between presidential elections in terms of turnout. That's really where we need you to go. We need you to go door to door on the campaigns that aren't very sexy. We need you to go door to door to get people who may not be known much outside of their district to get elected because they care about the policies you care about, whether it's education, healthcare, criminal justice. These are the things that affect your day-to-day lives. And then finally, and I'll take some questions. And then finally, I'll just say this. Wherever we go in 2020, I go back to the point that I made before, which is that look at whether or not, and the way you sort of will identify how a particular candidate has emerged as a potential nominee, and whether or not Donald Trump actually wins re-election. By the way, how many of you think today, it's okay, raise your hand, this is a safe space, how many of you actually think the president will be re-elected today? Believe that. Yeah, that's what I thought about that. You're not alone. There are a lot of voters in this country that believe the exact same thing. And they believe that because they believe that his support is deeply committed and devoted to him. But they also believe that because they don't think that the Democrats have made and will make a credible case to get them elected or to get us elected. And I think that ultimately is what you have to look for going into 2020. Identity politics is important, but identity politics is not just Black, Latino, Asian, LGBTQ. It's also rural. Identity politics is also ex-urban. It's also it's gender as well. There are many ways that people actually identify. It's used as a dirty word because it often refers to just people of color or poor people or people LGBTQ, and it's used derisively. But the truth is, everybody engages in identity politics because they see themselves as these fairly unique individuals that are trying to engage the process and hope that the people that they vote for actually supports their specific interests. So what an amazing thing when they can find other like-minded folks through the means and the methods that they do, like YouTube, like Facebook, like Instagram or Twitter. And when they do that, what do? They stay in those places. They stay in those silos. That confirmation bias is a hell of a thing. And that's what we have to break through. That's the challenge that Democrats have. It's not just saying that Donald Trump shouldn't be president. It's saying, how do we break people out of their silos? How do we talk to everybody? How do we share our common interests? And then proactively, positively talk about the ways in which we can make their lives better. Ultimately, it really just does come down to that. Can we make their lives better tomorrow than they are today? Bottom line. I'm going to stop here, so thank you all very much. I'm going to stop here. I really want to hear from you. We have time, so I can take quite a few questions. Please make them questions. You know how y'all are. But I'm happy to take them. Ladies first.
Okay, wait.
Got to get you on the record too, Mike.
Hi, I'm Amy Bear. I teach in the philosophy department here at Hofstra. Thank you so much for coming. I had the opportunity to hear Stacey Abrams speak on Sunday in Manhattan. It was very exciting, and she rejects the distinction between electability and progressive politics. She says that what Democrats need to do is just get out the vote, right? She saw that in Georgia, that there is a Democratic majority. So I'm just wondering what you think of that.
Whether or not we can just outright reject electability versus progressive politics, because you can have both.
If you get out the vote.
If you get out the vote. I agree with that. You can have a progressive leader that is electable. I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. My question is, in which candidate does that reside? Does those qualities reside? And what I'm wondering, I don't know if I've seen that in any one candidate yet, but I could down the road. And this is where the conversation about Joe Biden becomes really interesting, because there are a lot of people that are sort of keeping their, as they say, keep their powder dry, because they don't want to go all in financially or otherwise with some of the current candidates, because they're waiting to see if Joe can win, or Joe gets in the race. So, but the real question then is, does he really represent the progressive movement within the party? And then the next question is, does it matter? Because he might be the best person to beat Donald Trump. And in some ways, I view, whenever Donald Trump loses, whether it's in 2020 or 4 years from now, the next president, especially if it's a Democratic president, is going to be largely custodial. What I mean by that is that president will probably spend a lot of time undoing what Donald Trump did. So if that president is that way, you can have a lot of progressive politics sort of at the state and local level, while the president just undoes everything that Donald Trump has done. And at that point, does it matter who's there of the current crew? Not as much, but if you really believe that this president, not only that the next president and Democratic nominee should be a person that spends a lot of his or her time dialing back what Donald Trump has already done, and also leading the country's progressive vision, I think you can have both, but I just don't know who out there embodies that today. Yes. Oh, there's a gentleman in the back there. Yes.
I guess it's morning. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You spoke a few times about the connection to Trump using Twitter and social media. And as someone who connects to the idea of not having time to go and sit down in front of the TV and watch MSNBC and CNN, or even passes the newspaper stand on purpose because I'm not about to pick up a paper and read it. Do you feel like there is a progressive movement to making more use of social media in politics? And is that the right way to go, or do you feel like we should be regulating it and making that disconnect happen again so that there isn't that flow of information?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a fascinating question. I was actually interviewed yesterday about the use of digital tools in campaigns and elections. So let me go back to a statement I made about us knowing whether or not you vote. Let me go a little, I figured a question like this would come up so I could use this example, so thank you for this. Let me talk a little bit more about how we know that you don't vote. Every state party in the country has a voter file on every voter in that state. We license that from the DNC, who has a file that contains every voter in the country. That information, that raw information, is available to you for, if not free, a nominal cost from your Board of Elections. But the difference with what the difference in the voter file that we have is that it has what we call enhancements. So we have a sense of where you are on the spectrum, very liberal, very conservative. As I mentioned earlier, your propensity to donate, your willingness to volunteer. We don't know for whom you voted, but we can guess. And we also have an algorithm to determine whether or not you're African American, among other things, like a lot of stuff. The Obama voter file is like the gold standard. Why? Because there were a lot of articles about this, including one in The Atlantic called If I remember correctly, the nerds go marching in. What was amazing about the Obama era of politics, his voter file included a lot of social media analytics, all of your Google searches and your Facebook likes, all of those things now get added to information about who you are as a voter. So not only do we know whether you voted or didn't vote, we just know a whole lot of information about you. I always use the example of Radio Shack. Everybody remember Radio Shack? Yeah, it's been closed for a while. Remember buy anything at Radio Shack and they ask you for your information? That's not for warranty. They're collecting data on you. And if you go back to some of the articles about that bankruptcy, one of the most contested issues was who would actually get that data file, because it was a pretty substantial file of market information about you because you used Radio Shack. We have something similar in electoral politics also. We share that information. Campaigns share that information about you are. All of the controversy about Cambridge Analytics, remember all of that? That's what all of this was. It was all of this data mining about individual voters. Now, is that used in a positive way? It absolutely is, because besides social media, the digital tools that we have allow you to be able to be in Long Island and call voters in Texas to get them to support Beto O'Rourke. I had a friend who did that in Manhattan. She would just be on the phone all day calling for Beto. Digital tools help us to get quick information when we do our canvassing. It doesn't replace the old school, talking to an individual voter. It just means that we can get that information quickly. We can get more information on an actual voter. But social media is still going to be around and still going to be impactful in what we do, because it's how information gets out there and our ability to tamp down on negative information or incorrect information. So we still have to be vigilant about monitoring it, but I think you as a consumer of social media, because you can curate your own news and curate your own, data or information from where you want to get it, you have to be more vigilant about what you're getting, how you're receiving it, and what the platform knows about you. Although there are very few ways that you can hide it now, but because there's so much information about you out there. But social media is still going to be a tool that we have to manage and do a better job of managing. When I was talking about the president earlier, it's just never happened that the president of the United States would use that as his sole venue or medium, vehicle to communicate with voters. It just didn't happen that way before. And there's really no way to stop it. Interestingly enough. It's just that we have to be better at trying to counter it. And how that happens, is another story for another day. But that's why we're in one of the reasons that we're in such a unique time in our politics right now, because of the way that the president has used this vehicle. Yes.
I'm a different demographic in that I'm not a part of this community. I'm a part of the general public that has been invited, and I live nearby and have come to several things here. But we vote. My generation votes, and I'm sure I'm probably older than anybody else here in the room. I'm 90 years old, and I'm very involved in everything.
I want to look like you when I'm 90 years old. I don't look like me at 47.
I came here because I get the brochures, and I wanted to hear this, and I'm very upset because I remember an old book called The Media is the Message, and it seems to me that Donald Trump is the epitome of what he predicted. And I think that the media made Donald Trump, and I don't mean the programs, because I never watched what he was up, the programs, but rather in the way he was covered to the detriment of everyone else.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is what has to be countered come this next election, because I'm very worried. And I do agree, you have to get the young people out to vote. I have grandchildren who are 30, and they are very involved, and they always vote. I don't know whether it's because of came with mother's milk or what. But for a person like you in your position, and I have seen you, what is it that you are planning on doing in not just getting out the vote of the young people who don't vote, but my generation who do vote? Every one of my friends gets out in every single election because that's the way we were brought up. What are you going to do with the media?
So thank you for that, and I think you're absolutely right that there is a lot of. So there are two questions that I'll respond to that you've asked. But first, let me talk about the media and their coverage of Donald Trump during the campaign and subsequent to that.
During the primary.
During the primaries in particular,
They
absolutely.
made him.
Absolutely. So here's what's interesting. I would be on camera, on set all the time, and our segment get preempted because they wanted to cut to him. So if you think about it, are there communications majors in here? Or professors? Okay, great, awesome. So look, in some ways, what the media did fits right into what they do. They found a news peg, they covered what was going to make news, and Donald Trump always made news. It wasn't news I liked. It wasn't news that I wanted to hear. Poor John Kasich didn't break through at all. Rand Paul or Carly Fiorina or all of these other candidates. George Pataki, a former governor, probably the last of the Northeastern Rockefeller Republicans, just couldn't break through because everybody wanted to cut to what Donald Trump was saying, because Donald Trump would say something that everybody would be like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. But you know what happens? A year after saying, oh my God, I can't believe he said that, it's, oh my God, he's president, and I can't believe he said that. Right? Because there are consequences, as you've said, to consistently pointing the camera at somebody, which is really what the media does. But the problem was it was to the detriment of so many other voices that probably had better things to say and more valuable policy to offer the American voter. I think now they see, I don't say the error, because I don't know if they would actually call it an error, but I think they believe now how to keep that from happening again. But the problem is it's done deal. We got him. Covering a rally from beginning to end to the detriment of everybody else. And mind you, it's not just him speaking, it's him charging the people attending, lock her up. So it wasn't just him talking about what he would do, it's you, a voter, hearing all these people say lock Hillary up, that she's a crook, she's a criminal. So how are we supposed to sort of chime in if we don't get that same kind of airtime? That I think they've realized what their sort of role in this and are trying to keep that from happening again. I don't know how if it will change and how it will change, but I do think that they've found a way to create some balance. So having said that, going to the second part of your question about what we're going to do, what I'll do, I think the 2018 midterms were instructive because they went back to old school campaigning. Just talking about issues, talking about values, going door to door, talking to voters. Not presidential campaigns we say are in the air because it's a lot of ads and mail and TV and big events. But what we did as Democrats in 2018 was we ran in our districts. We didn't nationalize the races at all. We talked to voters in their districts. So when people say, oh, the party's moving so far to the left, not really. Because even though Alexandria won, so did Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, who is definitely not Alexandria. He's much more conservative Democrat. Ayanna Pressley wins in Massachusetts and John Kennedy's old district. So there is a tremendous diversity, both racially, ethnically, and ideologically, that can only have happened if the party recognized the need to not alienate voters and not to make assumptions for them, but to literally go back to old school campaigning, door to door, talking about policy, go to where voters live and talk about the things they want to hear. That's something that I think we got away from, that I think we went back to in 2018, and we hope we can maintain in 2020. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. And then
my name is Annika Zero. I'm a sophomore here at Hofstra and also a Center for Civic Engagement Fellow, so thank you for coming. Earlier you mentioned that Joe Biden observed that as candidates, they often explain why we should fire Trump and not hire them. On the activist side, I feel, in terms of voting and politics, I feel that we often focus on you should vote rather than why your vote matters. I was wondering if you could provide insight onto how we can explain to marginalized groups, especially if we belong to them, why our votes actually matter in the grand scheme of things, especially as they're discouraged by the elitism of the activist side and the elitism of the politics side.
Yeah, there's elitism, a lot of elitism to go around, isn't there? The answer to this question is a little interesting for me because I was actually an elector in the 26th election. Yes, I'm an actual elector, a member of the Electoral College for 2016. And obviously, since then, there's been a lot of conversation about getting rid of the Electoral College. The downside of that is that candidates would only campaign in like 10 cities in this country. So areas like Kansas and North Dakota and other states won't get any visits from presidential candidates. So I'm not sure that we should totally abolish electoral college, but there's got to be a better system than what we're doing right now. And I think in many ways that's one of the reasons people don't feel that their vote matters, because whether Hillary won by 10 votes or 10,000 votes in New York, she would win New York. But how does that person's vote actually matter, right? So we talk about that a lot. The problem is we really haven't found a better system yet. And there are going to be states in this country that are not going to want to hear that at all. So there's a tremendous pushback to any changes in the electoral college system. So that, I think, is one area where people might actually feel that their votes are counted more. But I go back to what I was saying before. It matters because when you vote, particularly on a local level, all of that politics is right at your front door. I cannot really describe it any better than that because, when Mayor de Blasio, and there's some issues with him now and all of that, he's going to Iowa, I don't want to get into all that, but, he came in talking about trying to close the education, the achievement gap between Black and white, or minority and white students. And one of the first things he did when he went into office is institute universal pre-K. And he was held accountable for that because he campaigned a lot on that. And that's one of those things that mayors do, and that is a popular vote. And it's a policy that over time I think will show a big change in the achievement gap because we started these young people early in formal education. But there are many, many, many more examples of that across the state and across the country. Not only is it about elected leaders that provide and promote good policy, it's also elected leaders that look like you. Do you know how many Latino mayors there were in the state of New York, the entire state of New York, how many Latino mayors there were in 2016? I think it's changed now. One in the entire state of New York. And I can't remember the name of the town. It was in upstate New York near Buffalo. It's killing me that I can't remember the town, and I went to visit him. But I was one Latino mayor. Do you know how many Black governors there have been in this country's history? How many Black governors have there been in this country's history? 4.
What's running? Look at that.
4. Oh, there were 4. And only 2 of them were elected. The first was PBS Pinchback. True, sir. PBS Pinchback. He was appointed during Reconstruction governor of Louisiana. That was Reconstruction. You know when the next Black governor took office? 1992. Douglas Wilder in Virginia. From Reconstruction and all the way to 1992. It's a big gap, right? And then after Wilder, both Patterson in New York, who was not elected, and Deval Patrick in Massachusetts, who was elected, served at about the same time. And so consider that we tell people it's important to vote because we need representation that looks like us and cares about the things we care about. And in some ways, we actually do see that actually happen in real life. When I remember when I started at Cornell in 1989, we didn't have the internet back then. I dated myself. We didn't have the internet, didn't have email, and all we had on campus didn't have cell phones. So we had a news ribbon and at the student union. And I remember walking in with a friend of mine who was from Queens, as he was Latino, and we looked at the news ribbon and said David Dinkins has been elected mayor of the city of New York, first African American mayor. And we looked at each other and said, look what we did. By the way, we weren't old enough to vote. But we looked at each other and said, look what we did. Why? Because there was a sense that our parents and our communities were all pushing for this major change in local politics. And that is empowering, not just for the people who voted, but for the children of the people who voted, because there's a sense that our lives are going to be better as a result of that. And I think that's sort of the biggest takeaway for me. It's not only from a technical standpoint, do we know if you didn't vote or not? But the truth is that we have seen change take place because of our exercising our right to vote. And the problem is that there isn't enough change coming before you, or there isn't enough change occurring to get a lot of folks out to the polls on a regular basis. And that to me is sad, because we engage in what some have called sort of moving towards this sort of political and policy equilibrium, right? We don't engage in dramatic change. We believe in practicing incrementalism, little changes here and there. So if there are only slight changes being made in governance, why would your vote matter? Because you want big change, and we're focused on little change. So why does your vote matter? Your vote matters because actually you all believe in change in the way we were taught not to in some ways. Think about how you grew up politically. You saw Barack Obama, an African-American president, which many of us never thought we'd see in our lifetime. But you experienced that. You lived through that. You became politically active because of that. Consider that you also saw him use government to bail out the auto industry and save the You saw him use his platform to move toward single-payer health care and the Affordable Care Act. You also, so you've seen him use government to do really big, important things. And that's the expectation that you have of your future leaders, because that's what you grew up seeing, and which is a little different from how we grew up. But it's going to be different from how folks who grew up after World War II, after Roosevelt, experienced how their government was supporting them. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge that that's how you view the work that we do. And then going back to what I was saying before, not sort of step on your expectations. And I think that's, if we have that conversation and I can convince people that significant change will come to their lives, that's probably the best way that I can tell them that their vote counts. Because otherwise, we're just going to be playing games of inches here. Like they say in football, it's a game of inches. We're just going to be moving an inch here, an inch there, and not really affecting positive change. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am, in the back.
What are your opinions on a woman being elected in 2020?
There should have been one in 2016. And so I feel strongly that there will be, I would tell you that of the candidates that I see now, the strongest are women. Kamala Harris came out very strong, Elizabeth Warren very strong. I mean, I have issues with the whole Native American thing, but that's another conversation for another day. But, you know, she came out strong, Kamala came out strong. I like Amy Klobuchar. I like her because, number one, if you look at everybody else, they're all coastal for the most part, right? And that's a problem because if you look at the map from 2016, most of the Democratic votes came from the coasts. And we didn't have any real support in the middle of the country. And Amy comes from Minnesota, really strong on policy, really tough. I actually think she can go at Donald Trump and give him the business. I really think so. Will she raise the money and be able to sort of compete that way? I don't know, but I really like her. So I actually think women have, today, I think the women in the race have a better shot than the men in the race at beating Donald Trump. And if you look at what happened in Chicago yesterday, there's a runoff. An African-American woman is going to be mayor of Chicago, which I think is the first time in their history. So there is a movement afoot, which has been in place for quite some time. But you see the role that women, and particularly African-American women, are in really holding down the Democratic Party. It's quite phenomenal. I have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Fred Davis, Hofstra class of '85, a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha. Can you talk just a little briefly about money in politics, and particularly
What? There's money in politics?
particularly there's a few billionaires who are looking to run, and obviously you had one on the Republican side, and to me there's probably was some effect of his money helping him. Also, of course, social media helped him a lot, but also his influence that is not seen, I think, helped him too. But can you talk a little bit about that, and would someone have a chance eventually who don't come from that background eventually to be president of the United States?
So great question, and I'll say it this way: you can be as rich, you can be the richest man in the world, but your money never goes before message. What I mean by that is, you can have all the money in the world, but if people don't like you, or if folks don't feel that you have a strong enough message, if people don't feel that you can actually make their lives better, or if you don't tap into that kind of emotional, you're not going to get elected. And history is replete with that. Now, can that person cause a problem for one of the candidates from the mainstream parties running like the Democrat? Yes. We saw that with Ross Perot. And if you ever see the documentary on George H.W. Bush, I think it was called 41, he's asked very specifically, because he ran against Clinton and Ross Perot, and he's asked very specifically, do you think Ross Perot cost you the election? He was like, yes. Next question. I'm not talking about that anymore. Like he was still to his death very bitter about this. So they can do damage. I don't think they can win, but they can do damage. And the truth is that voters still prefer a strong, positive message, and no matter how much money you have, but they have the ability to stay in a long time and get on the air. That's the challenge, number one. Number two, to the sort of larger, deeper question about money in politics, the problem is that the things that you need to do to run for office are really expensive. Staff, but really TV. If you found a way to make TV more cost effective or free, in some countries I've done campaigns in other countries, and they're free. You can only campaign within a specific period of time, but the TV stuff is free. If you can find a way to make what costs a lot of money free or costs less, then I think you take a lot of the money out. But right now, as long as candidates want to go on, they're going to be paying a lot of money to do so. Number two, because Citizens United said that corporations are people, we're going to have these independent expenditures that are going to rake in millions of dollars. We spent in 2008 and 2012 combined over $1 billion on an election. That is ridiculous. That is ridiculous, right? It's vulgar, actually. But as long as these independent expenditures are allowed to exist, you're still going to have a tremendous amount of money. We've tried. It's actually money that you actually, hard money that you give to a political candidate on the federal level in particular, is actually quite highly regulated. But it's that other money that gets spent, that and the ways in which that can be circumvented, I think still needs to get taken out. There seems to be some other folks coming in, which means it's probably time for me to go. I thank you all very much for coming by and giving me all of this.
Just want to say thank you again to our speaker for the day. We are